Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Nick Johnston. I'm going to be moderating today for our three speakers. The topic is, as you see, and hopefully why you're here, would you work for the military? We have two researchers, Jurriaan van Diggelen, an engineer, 1 year into his position in defense, safety and security at TNO in surface and aerospace warfare. We have Jurriaan van Diggelen, who is a senior research scientist in human-machine teaming with over 20 years of experience working with defense, intelligence, the police. And we have Dario Perfigli, he's a philosopher here at the section Ethics and Philosophy of Technology. And they're going to share their either research, their reflections about their own motivations, whether to and how to and why to participate in research that lends itself or is directly in service of militaries. But my function as the moderator, since, as you can imagine, it's a controversial topic, morally fraught. I'm also at the philosophy section at TPM, and as part of the introduction, I want to maybe get a vibe on the different feelings people have about the prospect, as you might be many of you young scientists, researchers, engineers, of conducting research which lends itself to military applications. What motivations, concerns, or considerations might you have? So in a moment, I might ask people to raise your hands to get a feel for the room. What I want to map are the many angles which might motivate or concern someone to work or not work in a military direction. You might have a particular way of framing your ethical concerns. You might have particular feelings about war as such. What sort of thing is war? You might have notions about what researchers' responsibilities are, how you think about the profession. What does it mean to be an engineer? What does it mean to be a scientist? And fourth, you might have views about what sort of things are technologies. And lastly, there might be just considerations about the world around you. What's true and what's not about maybe your government, politics at the moment, and ongoing conflicts. So first, don't worry about reading too much. If you've ever had to sit through an ethics class, you've probably heard it before. There's different ways people might express themselves. And we might hear that as people comment or question throughout the activity today. Some people might focus on the consequences. If I do or don't do military research, X, Y, or Z may happen. A really consequence-focused consequentialism. If you've sat through an ethics and engineering class, I'm sorry, because this is a repeat. Or maybe you think in terms of duties and principles. You have a duty perhaps as a citizen, or maybe as a scientist to participate or not participate in military research. But maybe you have reflections about what sort of person it makes you. What happens to your character if you work on these sorts of things? What sort of scientist, what sort of person are you? And maybe you have religious or other cultural, political considerations. Now, to get beyond the classic ethics intro course philosophy spiel, I'm curious now about what people think war is. Some people might oppose or support their defense industry because they have some commitments to pacifism. They think war is inherently immoral. They might be an absolutist about it. There's no moral wars. Some might say, well, at least most of them, none of the current ones are. Another classical sort of philosophical framing is that of just war theory, the notion that, no, some wars are just and some wars are unjust. Supporting just wars is fine or even good. Supporting unjust wars is bad. And others might say, listen, war isn't something you talk in moral language about. You might be a realist, is a term for it. Now, I'm curious to get a feel for the room, to see ourselves as others among others, a diversity of perspectives. Is there anyone who thinks, you know, war is an inevitable feature of politics and morality doesn't apply? Okay, we have a realist or two in the audience. And who thinks some wars are just and some wars are unjust, and there's criteria we can use to evaluate them? Okay, a handful, quite a few more hands. And then who might regard themselves as a pacifist, either in absolute or at least in nearly all cases? And quite a few hands. Again, just good to know and to understand sort of where we are in a diversity of perspectives and how they might interact with other considerations about, we have a notion of what war is, but what does it mean to be a scientist? What does it mean to be an engineer? What's the nature of research? Some philosophers have argued, hey, research is discovering the unknown. You can't be held responsible. You don't have moral obligations towards that which you can't predict. Others say, hey, you know, depending upon what you're working on, you have a pretty good idea of what's going to follow from that. Others might be comfortable or less comfortable with basic versus applied research, fundamental or applied. And what does the job carry with it, for example? Should we expect scientists and engineers to engage in ethical reflection? Who thinks, for example, it comes with the job that you think about war and politics? Who says yes? Okay. And then who says, not my job. It's not the scientist's function. It should be the function of other institutions, perhaps. So, again, a diversity of views. Lastly, or not lastly, nearly last, penultimately, there's questions about what sort of things are technologies. Some might say, we had a discussion last week, if I'm a swordsmith and I make a sword, in the end someone does something with the sword, whether it's good or bad, it's a matter of application. It's not built into the sword. Technologies are neutral. Another view, easy opposite, technologies aren't neutral. You can build into something good or bad things. Some technologies, some have argued, are evil in themselves. They can be designed maliciously. Who thinks, listen, technologies are neutral, they have affordances, all sorts of things can follow from a product? Raise your hand, tech-neutral position, a couple more hands. And for whom are technologies not neutral, that they have features of quite a lot of hands? Interesting. And lastly, there's a lot of empirical considerations. What's true about the world and how does that shape how I think about what I should do as a scientist, how it relates to conflicts and the defense industry? For example, who here might say, I trust my government more or less in the armed forces? Like, we come from different countries, right? So there's a diversity of positions. Who might say, my government and armed forces more or less has earned my trust within reason? Quite a few hands. And who says, nah, not my country, not my situation? Quite a few hands as well. But other people coming from a country which is under threat, perhaps, might feel motivated. Who feels that their country, their homeland, is safe from military aggression? Raise your hand if you think right now you're okay. Versus those who say, listen, man, we're on the brink. Hands up. So, something to be mindful of throughout the conversation. People have different experiences of literal safety from war. Also, how do you feel about foreign participation in broader projects, who you're working with, right? You have to be mindful of, perhaps some people feel that their research might tie into something broader. And how do you feel about the arms industry? For example, raise your hand if you feel the arms industry is net positive in your country, in your context. That the industry's effects on civil society, and then those for whom, in your context at least, where you're coming from, the arms industry's effects are a net negative. Hands omhoog. Okay, so that's the end of my spiel, narrowly within time. But the point I want to make before we move on to our speakers is these can interact in all kinds of ways, right? Someone might feel motivated by personal features of character, that might be their ethical language, because it has something to do with peace, that you want to have a peaceful character. You might be a pacifist because of what it means to be you, who you are as a person. And that might be shaped by other concerns about then what it means to be a scientist, and so on. Someone else might say, well, I have duties as a citizen, and the condition of my war is one of great threat. I don't feel safe, and so therefore my citizenly duties motivate me to prepare or to support my nation's preparation for war. So you could imagine the rubric, all kinds of intersections and interactions of beliefs and motivations, and we're going to see some of those in our speakers today. So without further ado, I want to move towards our first speaker, in whose commentary you can maybe see some of these, connect with, disagree, think about questions you may have. After a little while of speaking, we'll open the floor to Jurriaan for questions. After that, we'll move to the next speaker, and then after all speakers have gone, another plenary. So just know there's plenty of opportunities, write them down if you need to. But first, an introduction. So Jurriaan van Diggelen is a senior research scientist in human and machine teaming at TNO. As we mentioned, over 20 years of experience working with defense, intelligence, and police organizations. He has work in sort of AI and safety critical contexts. His educational background, he has a PhD in artificial intelligence and currently leads TNO's defense research program on machine teaming. So we want to put the floor for Jurriaan van Diggelen. And I will pass over the little clicker to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks, Nick. That was a great introduction, and I wouldn't be able to do that. I'm not going to give you a lecture. I'm just going to tell you my personal story, how I started studying AI and ended up working in a military organization and doing research from the military. So I don't know the truth, but I'm just going to share my position on this. And when I was 20, this is me, I was kind of a hippie person. I really wasn't into fighting. And I definitely promoted non-violent resistance and saw the use of force only as last resort, prefer diplomacy and international cooperation, and definitely invest in justice, prevention, and social equality. And I still agree with all of these principles. Definitely think this is a great inspiration. Huh? So Gandhi with the violentless resistance, that you can solve big conflicts without going to war, but just by protesting. And it worked in that case. And Aikido, so I think Aikido means something like being in harmony with the energy. So the whole philosophy about this martial art is not to let force clash with each other and oppose violence with violence, but to redirect the energy of the opponent and put it in a neutral position. Right? So I think this is a great inspiration about how to deal with violence. This is a photo I took in 2003, I believe, at the peace demonstration against the invasion of Iraq. I definitely think there are unjust wars, right? I think this is an example of it, that the US should not have invaded Iraq. And I believe that at the moment, and I still believe that. But definitely things have changed in my stance, right? So this was me in 2005. And I think lots of things has changed, and it basically made me develop my ideas on this further. So first of all is the geopolitical context. I think it matters a lot. In 2005, the Dutch MOD was in war with Afghanistan, and the big themes were things like comprehensive approach and winning the hearts and minds of the local population, right? Because it was very much a peacekeeping situation, and the Dutch MOD, they understood that they should be doing something like nation building and earn the trust of the local population in order to make it a thriving society. So hearts and mind was an important one there. And the other things, there was not a big threat to the Dutch military at the moment. So the research that was funded by Defense often also focused on other things like crisis management. Also offered us the opportunities to work with academia, who were sometimes reluctant to work with defense, but then we called it crisis management, and we could do these projects together with universities, right? So that's how it worked. But of course, things have changed, and I labeled the things here that affected the Dutch MOD. So if things or crisis or wars are not mentioned here, it's not because I think they're insignificant, but they did not affect the strategy of the Dutch MOD. What did affect the strategy of the Dutch MOD was definitely the stance of Russia, which began in Crimea in 2014. And of course, now we have the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and add to that the stance of Trump of increased isolationism, which definitely made European countries aware that they should be able to defend themselves. So this had a huge impact on the Dutch military. But also AI changed, right? When I started, there were expert systems that couldn't do very much. And then in 2015, they had all kinds of applications in the military, and the military saw that. They definitely wanted AI, because that allowed them to move faster. And there were demonstrations about killer robots, weaponized AI systems. The defense AI investments just rocketed. And now we have autonomous robots, decision support, intel analysis, social media campaigns. It's everywhere in the safety organizations. Combine that with my career at TNO, I started doing lots of crisis management and space projects. But I ended up in a couple of projects, also like ELSA Lab Defense, which is called Ethical, Legal, Societal Aspects of AI in Defense, which also led me to rethink these things a little bit further. So it is a little bit like the Oppenheimer dilemma. Most of you might have seen this movie. This was, of course, a very critical moment in history, and if you know the story, Oppenheimer felt a deep sense of responsibility. He infamously said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," where he quoted a Hindu scripture. Well, that says a little bit about that he knew that his technology would have an impact on the world. The atomic bomb is an example where it was clear how it was going to be used. So he was developing this technology, and there was one use that this thing would have, which that it was going to be thrown on the enemy, right? But he also thought, well, if we don't build the bomb, the Nazis might build one. And he had these thoughts, well, using the bomb could also end the war sooner, and it might actually save lives. Right? I think this is a very difficult dilemma. I'm not going into that, because I think also the dilemma that we have, our dilemma, is slightly different. Right? So when we ask ourselves the question, should I participate in research project X? It is sometimes more difficult to understand how this technology will eventually be used. So that brings us to the question, do I carry responsibility for the outcomes of the research project? The way I think about it, well, there is something like dual use. So it could be that you are working on a robot in agriculture that does some fertilizes crops, but that very same robot could also be used in warfare, right? So there is always this dilemma of dual use. And as you also noted, the purpose of an artifact is often embedded in the design, right? So does not participating set me free from responsibility? The way I look at it is that refraining from doing your research also is an ethical decision. So not to do something is an ethical decision. I will go into that. How am I doing on time?
8 minutes.
8 minutes left, okay. So one of the things that we asked when we had one of our project meetings of ELSA Lab Defense, we had a lot of researchers, about 40 in the room, and they were all doing PhD research on the ethical aspects of AI. A lot of them on different domains, on agriculture, on police, on healthcare. And we asked them the questions, how do you feel about the military? Well, it's very mixed pictures. We differentiated between these different topics. How do you feel about ELSA considerations of military AI? 56% said strongly agree, and the others were less sure, and 4% strongly disagree. So they even thought that working on the responsible AI in the military is already objectionable. Then we can make it a little bit more difficult for the answers. Non-weaponized autonomous surveillance drones, so these drones that fly around and interpret camera data, right? Very interesting application in defense. AI-driven military intelligence, so analyzing intel with a specific purpose. AI-driven military logistics. You can also transport goods using autonomous vehicles. There's also military application. Is that an ethical application or not? Human resource management, also of interest to the military. Autonomous cyber defense. AI-driven cognitive warfare. Having AI spread misinformation in wartime situations. Decision support of targeting, so systems that support the human who should be a target. Well, quite a critical application, until probably the most controversial one, autonomous weapon systems. Robots that autonomously fly around are weaponized and can decide which targets to engage. Another dimension could be, what organization would you work for? The Dutch Research Funding Agency, most of them are okay with that. NGOs like the Red Cross, Dutch Military of Defense, the MOD of other EU NATO countries, of non-EU NATO countries like USA, Norway, Turkey, MOD of non-hostile, non-NATO states, right? And then defense industry. And where you see here is that defense industry is probably the most controversial one, which I find also kind of surprising, because if you want to build up defense, the industry is at the end of the research innovation chain. So you could argue, why would it matter if you are doing research at the beginning or doing the final bit? But this is actually how people responded. And let me explain how I would respond to these questions. Not saying that it's any better or worse, but this is my stance on it. And I will give a short lecture on why I think we have a state and have a military at all. So this is why I think it's important. So we have a society, and of course when you have a society, the problem is, how do you keep your society safe, and how do you protect it from somebody burning down your house or killing a family member, or another big country invading your small country, right? And they have found an answer to that, which is the state. So if you study the history of violence, it used to be a very unsafe place. There was not much you could do when you were attacked. If you were invaded by another country, it was the weakest force lost the war. So it was really the rule of the strongest that prevailed. And in order to do something against that, they found out that you can develop a state, and you have a social contract between society and state. I did not make this up. This is done by philosophers 300 years ago, people like Rousseau. And what does this social contract mean? Well, it means that the society grants political legitimacy to the state. And in return, the state has a monopoly of violence. So the society is not allowed to solve problems using violence, and they give that right to the state. And the state, in return, protects the society, and they have the only institutions that can legitimately use violence. And in the Netherlands, these are Ministry of Defense, police, the AIVD, and the intel services, and the military intel service, right? And of course, it can be very scary to have these organizations in your state that are allowed to use violence, right? So we have another social contract that they regulate their use of force, and in return, the society trusts the state that they use it wisely. The state must ensure that force is not arbitrary and make sure that there are accountability mechanisms in place, and the society has the function to oversee the government and make sure that these are transparency and check whether they are using this force wisely, right? And sometimes this is a balance, and sometimes it is out of balance, like toeslagenaffaire. What happened there? The state abused their power, but there is this mechanism in place to find out about it and to correct it, right? So this is, in my opinion, the only thing that worked. So we had violent, very violent situations that are also very violent for minority groups for thousands of years, and this mechanism has led to peace in Europe or in the Netherlands for 60 years now, and it's more peaceful also as an individual now than ever before in history. So I think it definitely supports these peaceful values, and I also think that we should have these organizations strong, such that they can play this role of protecting the society. And this, when AI is involved, the danger is that these organizations, they will become much more powerful because they are enabled by AI. And in a way that is needed because they need to compete with the enemy. So when the enemy gets stronger because they are using AI, they must be able to match that strength, otherwise they could not protect the society. But we should also be careful to make sure that these checks and balances are not out of balance. So that is why research is needed in responsible innovation to make sure that they still are using that power wisely. So, answering these questions myself, my position on this is that I would work on all of these systems, but in a way that we are independent, right? So when I work on autonomous weapon systems, I can also say these things are absolutely unacceptable, right? So that could also be an outcome of research. And I would work for all of these agencies, and this is where I start to doubt a little bit. I wouldn't mind working for defense industry as long as I am independent. But if I would get an order by defense industry and they would force me to take a certain position, right, and not take into account the ethical aspects, I am really not sure what to do. I have not been in that position yet, but that is something that I find difficult. And another problem is working for non-EU NATO countries with declining democracies. Well, the USA, I don't know. I don't know what my position on that is. That is something new for me, and I'm struggling with that. I don't see the point in working for non-hostile, non-NATO states, because they are not part of that social contract, right? And NATO supports the alliance that keeps us safe. I don't see the point working for these supplier or opdrachtgevers. Besides that making money, but that is not a motivation for this, I think. Okay, so then I will end up in time. Questions for discussion. I would be interested to talk about whether you would work for a military research. What your thoughts on this are, on this argumentation. Should academia engage in military research or not? And then also think about saying no to something is also making a moral decision. So it could weaken the Dutch safety organization. And I would like to have that discussion that we also then talk about that, right? So how does your position promote peaceful principles when faced with aggression? So let's make it a realistic discussion. Thank you.
So we have time for a few minutes for questions just for Jurriaan. We'll follow it for the others, but there will be another plenary moment at the very end for questions further. So, yeah. I'm supposed to hold the microphone, but go ahead.
You mentioned that we've been in peace for the past 60 years, but 60 years ago the Netherlands still had colonies. Wouldn't you say that maybe we have been in peace within the country, but we still exported a lot of violence and war? We exploited them as well, of course. And that the research you do when you do this is not only about our safety within the Netherlands, but also the export of violence, for example, also through NATO in other countries.
Yes. So I think the use of the military is a political decision. So the Dutch military doesn't go to war. It's a political decision how to use that. And the Dutch Defence Organization has two main tasks, which is to protect Dutch soil, and the other one is to preserve the international rule of law. So that means international humanitarian law, which is, well, there are international rules that aim at keeping the world safe. Whether they are doing a very good job at that is, in my opinion, a different discussion. But it's a political discussion, and it's not per se the problem of the military. Yeah, go ahead.
My question was more about your responsibility doing research in fueling this military. Because if you do research, it can still be used in those cases.
It can be, but if it is used properly by a democratically elected a government, then it's used in a good way and it can prevent violence, right? Because I'm sure you agree with international humanitarian law, which states that a smaller country cannot invade a larger country. And in my opinion, having laws like that are only meaningful if you can enforce them. Right? So that is my position on that.
Sir, if I can help you out with it. What people don't see is it's not about the Netherlands trying to do its job. It's about knowing that the enemy is doing it anyways. Knowing that the enemy is developing AI systems to kill people. Knowing that the enemy is trying to use the information domain to target us as civilians makes us responsible to also engage in that conflict. So to help you out, we have to. And yes, there is a moral line, but if the enemy does it, why shouldn't we?
Do you have a response?
Well, I thank you for trying to help me out, but I have my own ideas about that. But I think this is an excellent discussion, and the only thing that I would like to maybe ask back is, what would be the alternative?
To whom is this?
Well,
is this
maybe we can do that later. Maybe what do you think, Nick?
I mean,
we can also continue with the other.
I think maybe another question from another participant right now, because we only have a minute, and then there will be more later. Sorry, I saw one here. Oh, I'm sorry.
So yeah, I'm just wondering. So say, for example, in AI, you work on an algorithm or some part, and say it originally has good intentions or something, but then maybe when you're no longer working on it, somebody else takes it, sees how it could be applied to another part. Do you feel responsible, or how do you feel about it?
Yeah, these are difficult questions, right? So, can you give an example, maybe? Because I think that the difficult decision always in warfare is that there is some kind of arms race going on. And because the enemy is doing it and they are developing AI, they can be faster on the battlefield and they can use uncrewed systems on the battlefield. And the response to that could be to develop autonomous systems itself. For example, also with autonomous weapon systems, they could be also used to target other autonomous systems. Whether I like that kind of dynamics and whether I like to be part of that, not really. I don't think it's a very nice thing that's happening in the world that we're building AI. I definitely also do not think that AI is going to make us a much safer world. Well, I think the alternative is worse when we do not invest in the military.
Okay. This is quad timing. It's a perfect moment then to move to the next speaker,
okay.
If that's okay. So thank you, Jurriaan. And we will move now to Luca van der Peet. Okay, so for introduction, Luca van der Peet holds an MS in, Master's in Science in Computational Engineering from Aachen University, and also a Master's in Philosophy of Science, Technology, and Society from the University of Twente. He works currently at TNO as a junior scientist in Unit Defense, Safety and Security, in surface and aerospace missiles, correct? Or warfare, pardon, okay. And in his spare time, he keeps up with global politics. So, Luca, it's over to you. And here's that.
Oh, yeah. I won't need that one.
Ah, okay.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm not going to use any slides. I'm just going to talk about my perspective on this. So I want to latch on Jurriaan's introduction as well. I'm not here as a beacon of moral wisdom or anything of that sort. I'm figuring these things out as I go as well. It's not like I had a period of retreating to the mountains like a hermit where I was reflecting of all the possible dilemmas I could face and then entering this field with eternal wisdom. In preparation of this event, I was looking at this question, would you work for the military? And it struck me a bit as a weird feeling, because it's not a question we pose to other domains that we find in society. It's like we don't ask, like, would you work in healthcare? Or would you work for the government? Or so it's a question that occurs less frequently. And it got me a bit asking why that could be. But before getting into that, I will just tell you a bit what my path was that led to me being in this position, because I also never thought in advance that I would end up in such a position. Frankly, when I was studying engineering, I had a friend who did an internship at an arms manufacturer, and back at that point, I was mocking him and criticizing him. It's like, how can you do that? I didn't have really good arguments for that back then. Thinking back, I had this intuitive sense that, how could you do that? Just like that. But things have happened since then that shifted my position severely. And the main thing is that I visited Ukraine several times before the war started. And I have still connections there with whom I'm closely in touch today. And in February of 2022, there was a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, who had emigrated out of Ukraine, was living in a different country, was building their new life. And I was visiting her because that's when the COVID restrictions got finally lowered. And it was the first opportunity to see her after a long time. And as it so happened to be, it was the third week of February, and that week on Thursday the 24th was the day that Russia launched its assault on Ukraine. And that was an undescribable shock to us, waking up to that news. In those few hours, the first thing we did was she was trying to contact her mother, who was in Kiev at that moment, while the bombardment started, while the attack was launched. Trying to figure out how she was doing, what information we could give her, what she could do. at the time, she was I was scanning multiple live feed news websites, looking for every tiny bit of information, seeing if there's anything that I could hold on to that could give me some hold on the situation. And we were faced with momentary, very strange and very impossible situations. A situation that she was sheltering in a house in Kiev with a few other relatives, mostly women and a young child. And we were faced with the question, like, should we urge her to make a run for the underground shelters rather than sheltering there? And we were looking at each other and we didn't know how to answer that question. It's an impossible question to grapple with, like, because you would feel immediate or like intense regret either way if something were to happen. At the same time, we also had a common friend who was in Kiev, who was a trained medic, and she was called into service right from the get-go. So I was also in touch with her during those few hours and with the fear she went through and the feeling she went through. And all of that had a lasting impact on me. I can say now, fast-forwarding to now, that the mother of my friend who emigrated out of Ukraine, she is now in safety. She's living also abroad and building also a new life. But my medic friend, she's in Kiev still, and she's contributing still there. I'm still in touch with her as well. And so this experience has left a scar on me. I no longer could not do anything. I could not do anything about this anymore, because while the news cycle eventually normalized again to focus less on this conflict, this stayed with me permanently and is something that is on my mind every day today. So I also don't think anymore. Still don't think that this is something that's far away or doesn't affect me. It really, really affects me when I'm in touch with them or when I hear again the next assault that was launched on Ukraine. So I do like to answer, to get back to this question, would you work for the military? I have the opposite. Like, I feel internally like a strong sense or duty or responsibility to get engaged to do something against that, to prevent it from happening again or prevent it from happening here. And for me, it became almost like it's like a psychological compulsion, which is maybe something we can have in the panel discussion later as well. It's like, I don't know where to put myself really on the spectrum that Nick introduced in the beginning, if it's, because I don't feel like it's a conclusion come to in rational and reasonable reflection, that this, like, I didn't read Kant and then saw the categorical imperative and I thought, oh yeah, I need to, this is the maxim I should follow. It's really a psychological compulsion that drives me into this. And, but I do believe that by being a scientist in this domain, I contribute to the safety and the protection of what I value here. Now, since I started working at TNO, at the Unit of Defense, Safety and Security, I noticed a few changes in my immediate environment as well. So I had some friends and family members who were usually quite eager to ask me, like, how my studies were going, what career choices I was facing, who stopped asking questions about that. And also meeting new people sometimes, when the topic of a job came up, I was met with this strange question, or with this question, so what is it like working for defense? And then paired with a suspicious look. And it got me wondering maybe if there's like something of a stigmatization against the field, like understandably so, because as I said, I had the stigmatization of my friend who did his internship at an arms manufacturer. But it seems to me a bit in a tacit way, as if we have a separation between the military and normal society or normal occupations. To be exaggerated is a bit wildly. It's a bit like military we associate with death, destruction, violence, and that's the domain of psychopathy. That's where people who are out of their mind go to. And then there's normal society, normal occupations, and that's where people go who seek peace and harmony and happiness, and that's where normal people are. So I was wondering whether this separation is, or like where the separation comes from, and whether this is a phenomenon that happens across the board or is something maybe unique to here. And I think, in my view, this is something that can be culturally contingent, and it may be to do, I'm just speculating here, that maybe some societies feel less of an intermingling, let's say, with the military domain, because they have the luxury of putting it a bit to the outskirts of society. Because if you have the perception that you live in safety, then the military is something that lives is at the border of society. But looking, for example, at a country like Finland, where 1 in 6 people has a military education or has undergone military training, I would imagine that this tacit separation between the military and the society does not go down so smoothly, because it wouldn't make any sense, because every person either has undergone training or knows somebody who has undergone training and is involved somehow in the military. So having this like mental, psychological separation between the two would feel strange, in my view. So coming back to the Netherlands, then, it is my view that we don't have the luxury of seeing the military as something separate or at the border, because we are connected to our neighboring countries, not only through land masses, but also through treaties and through common values as well that we share in Europe, and also increasingly by friends and families that just move across the borders and closer to the conflict that's going on in the East. And it is also quite known for quite a while that Russia is involved in a hybrid warfare against NATO countries, damaging pipelines in the Baltic Sea, for example, hacker attacks that even brought down some websites from municipalities in the Netherlands, supply chain sabotages in the UK, and even recently there was in the news that a mall that burnt down in Warsaw was attributed to Russian sabotage as well. So I feel like by separating society from the military, that we also maybe run the danger of believing that the conflicts don't affect us either. But I think the times are changing now, and that this chaos that has dominated the past few years is looming over us, and that's what drives me right now, and led me to the position I am in. So, yeah.
We'll turn it over again to questions. Sorry. So, hands if people have questions for Luca.
I'm sorry that it's not a question, but I want to thank you for your openness and your emotional vulnerability that you're showing by telling this story. That's just what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Yeah.
Other questions and comments? Okay. Here. Sorry, I'm supposed to hold it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experience. As I was listening to you, I was thinking about why does war still need to be such a widespread, in your opinion, a widespread experience? Like, why, like in the day and age that we are now, like it's not like the war in the past. It's not like you need to have personal conflict. All conflicts affect population, and all conflict tend to be, it's a different type of war than it used to be in the past. Wouldn't the defense effort should rather be targeted on eliminating the source of this, like, I don't know if I can explain myself very well. It's a thought, ongoing thought, but I was just wondering, because we have so much technology and we are so able to like target specific targets, why does it have to be that civilians and populations have to be affected, and why is it not more central powers, let's say?
So is the question more like why we don't have hot wars directly, and instead it's more tacit, like this what people call hybrid warfare, where we sabotage and then we have like plausible deniability. No, it wasn't us. It was an unnamed chip that damaged the pipeline. Are you talking about like hot wars, direct attacks, physical attacks, and on the other hand, more like maybe cyber attacks? Or
yeah, I'm talking about having the people that won the conflict have the conflict amongst each other and not, you know, involving everybody else.
Like spillover. You mean this, are you talking about spillover of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, let's say, for example, into Europe, or I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that, I guess. It's
like,
I don't.
Okay. Well, I think first of all that if we take Russia, Ukraine as the example, I think that the way the war is going on and people are attempting to end it, the way it looks like to me, it will not end in a satisfying way for anyone, and especially not for Ukraine. And I also don't think that this will mark suddenly an end and will hail in an era of prosperity and peace again. I think there's a fundamental rethinking in Europe going on now with respect to its defense, because the new thinking, in my view, can be summarized as, if we want peace, we need to prepare for war. And I think there needs to be more deterrence, there needs to be the more credible force against possible aggressors. But the aggressor, of course, wants to prevent that. So, of course, they will try to spread their sabotage acts as much as possible into any possible member of the alliance. And I think that's the strategic thought behind the spreading of the conflict to other countries as well. I hope that answers your question. Sorry. Okay. Can talk after.
Sorry. One of the ethics of war technology, especially that I've recently had some sort of like observation about and also seen discussed essentially in ethics about technology, specifically, for example, AI technology, is that increasingly, as we develop these technologies, they become more and more layered strategies. So, for example, the command layer, that is essentially the military force that you are, or your opponent in this case, they move underground with drones moving up in the air. And then increasingly, the civilians are sort of in between, in that they do not, they become the more primary target of any of the weaponry that's coming on. And as we are developing new ways to either counter, but also to develop our own AI technology, and also more specifically like drone technology in this sense, I guess, it's becoming clear that as this technology develops, the civilian is more and more and more often the target casualty here, and they will only excessively get so. Is there a worry that you, and especially, for example, these developments that are mostly aimed at state actors, also exasperate this? Because at this point, especially with the nuclear, in this case, Russia is nuclear, so it's kind of hard to just go all in, right, in a regular sense. But we also see this technology being developed in the Middle East, with, for example, Gaza, where we also see a massive casualty rate on civilians with these kind of weapons. So the question is here is, even if we want to develop militarily, is it also not a question that we should question why we're developing it in a certain way and a certain command structure that is developed in a way? Because if we start escalating like this, and we only keep escalating like this, there is the question that at that point, the main casualty will always be civilian.
Well, that's a tough nut. Okay, right off the start, I don't know if I have a good answer for you for that. I would say, yeah, that the development of technology and the development of command structure will probably go hand in hand. But I don't know, like I don't know, don't have enough experience on this domain to make, to point at clear alternatives or clear ways of developing. So I'm afraid I cannot answer your question. I think it's a better question better directed at a higher up in the military maybe. Although the fear of exasperating civilian casualties is something that is, in my view, inherent in this preoccupation. Like that's something I grapple with in anything I work with. But that's also why I work in missile defense.
So, as for timing, I'm going to shift to our last speaker, but we have a plenary afterwards. So thank you, Luca.
Thank you.
Okay. So our next speaker is Dario Perfigli. He has an interdisciplinary background combining media studies, human geography, STS, and philosophy to explore and question societies and technologies' relations. His primary research is about the responsibility and innovation and safe and sustainable design, but in the chemical industrial domain. So a bit of a different approach. And other fields of research include environmental ethics, philosophy of technology, post-human, and critical theory. So we pass now to Dario. Here's the...
Oh, it's stuck. Okay. Super.
Oof. Is it going backwards?
Yeah.
Ah, sorry.
Hello.
Okay, it's in your hands.
Yes. Okay. Ta-da-da. Okay, thanks, Nick. Nick, for the introduction. Yeah. So, welcome. And what I want to talk today to you is not so much maybe related to the military context, but rather like reflect more on how actually responsibility and ethics is taught to engineers and how it's related to science. And in this sense, I thought it was also relevant as, for instance, at the philosophy section, we often give courses about responsibility in engineering and responsibility in science. So I thought it was something interesting to reflect, especially given the question of today about will you work with the military. So in this sense, there are like four main things that I would like to do. So first of all, like think of science not only as kind of an individual perspective, but rather as a form of labor. Also, I want to have use chemistry. So my main field as a case, and particularly talk about chemistry in the use of warfare. In this sense, with this example, I want to kind of go a little bit to try reframe the question about ethics, or at least how it's usually like put, and also how we usually teach it here at the here in Delft. And then at the end, like try to make some connection between ethical science and the military. So first of all, from research to labor. So usually research ethics focuses a lot of individual choices, and probably some of you also took courses here in Delft where we teach engineering ethics, and a lot of time we use like some kind of ethical framework, for instance, deontology, virtue ethics, to give some kind of ideas in how to understand responsibilities in research and in engineering context. And in this sense, we can also see how this usually is kind of comes out in the real world, as for instance, use of professional code of conduct. In this sense, there is this underlying idea of as a researcher as kind of autonomous agent, taking very much a kind of a normative, prescriptive approach. And in this sense, a lot of emphasis is often on the actual end of process of discovery. And of course, this makes complete sense, since at the basis of science, this is actually the action of discovery. But science is not only about discovery. Actually, science is also a form of work. It's labor. It's structured, it's founded, and has certain directions. So in this sense, I want to a little bit like shift the perspective and try to take this approach. What if the issue, the ethical issue of research is not so much about actually the individual per se? Of course, it's something important, so I don't want like to completely debunk this, but I just want to ask a different question. And what if one of the ethical problems of research is how is it organized as a form of labor? So the special case of chemistry, my research focus primarily on chemistry. I try to study it from a societal perspective, and particularly I study more for civilian applications, especially like inside industry, but of course chemistry also has connection with war. And I think chemistry is an interesting case, particularly because it stands as a middleman between what is like basic research and applied research. So why other type of science, for instance, physics is very much interested in describing a certain phenomena, chemistry as its fundamental component, something of making a product. So we want to make real changes in the world. So in this sense, there's also this view that someone have argued that chemistry poses itself between a science and a technology. And given this kind of drive for application, also chemistry has a deep history of being connected with industry. So has a clear connection through societal application. In this sense, I think it's also a very interesting kind of case, especially as also Jurriaan mentioned, when we think also at its dual uses. So in this sense, chemistry has been used in a number of different cases. For instance, in the battlefield, a big example, for instance, Agent Orange was a chemical developed as a pesticide and then used in the battlefield during the Vietnam War. But let's see a little bit how usually kind of ethics in chemical research is usually kind of framed. What type of kind of analysis, what type of questions are usually asked, and what is kind of the dominant framework. So usually there's this understanding of chemists as a moral agent, and in this sense, it is kind of where like the basis of the view starts from. And of course, this is something like, I mean, that is important to consider, and I agree with it, but it also is how it's usually primarily like framed, and also where most of the attention is poisoned on. And then, of course, there is this ethics in the laboratory practice, as the laboratory is the main place in which actually chemistry takes place. So in this sense, concern about safety, for instance, about toxicity, always best practice in this sense is where a big part of chemical research, ethics in chemical research takes place. But also, and this is probably more interesting for today, is connected with this moral idea of science. So in this sense, of course, scientific research should be like should promote integrity and trustfulness, and be open to communication, be transparent. So it also has to be for the good of society. In this sense, it has to be like usable. Or we kind of know this thing, right? Right, the best practice of science, basically. And also, and maybe this is most importantly, should go for tackle societal needs. And this, of course, is represented in Professional Code of Conduct. But also, it has this kind of double role. So this is not only the case. And here, as an example, I want to take the example of the case of Nepal. Probably like Nepal is something that everybody here kind of knows. It is part of our collective imaginary. It has this kind of devastating image of bombing that created this big disaster with flames. And Nepal is a chemical story, actually. And today, what I want to do and try to discuss through the use of Nepal is actually taking from two perspectives. The first perspective is to focus on its inventor, Louis Fuselier. He was an organic chemist at Harvard, and he developed Nepal in 1942 as on request of the US Defense during the Second World War. And here we kind of know a little bit how the story goes. A scientist makes an invention under circumstances of war. He kind of, at first, he's happy about his invention because he sees that he can save lives, he can take people out of the battlefield and end the war as soon as possible. So before a lot of enthusiasm, but then after, he regrets it. And then after, we are here today asking the question, was this person responsible? Is this person accountable? But of course, we can ask also the provocative question, what do we do about determining if it was or not accountable? What are the gains, right? And in this sense, I also think this tells something about our often ethical and responsible kind of reasoning, where we frame as having a specific individual to have accountable on a specific kind of individualistic approach on responsibilities. But then, in this sense, is where I want to do the shift, and instead of seeing like ethics as something as individually framed, but rather ethics as a way of approaching relationships. In this sense, I like a lot how Judith Butler proposes as ethics as a way of as a performative act in which it is shared with others. So in this sense, we see how labor, for instance, can be read under this analysis. And what does this mean? That the way that we address a sort of situation, how we speak about it, how we act about it, what sense do we make about it, is also guide of our ethical understanding and can lead to other ethical questions. And for this reason, I want to take the case of Dow Chemical, that was the supplier of napalm for the US military during the Vietnam War. And in this sense, the role that the Dow Chemical had was actually not a role of invention. So it was not really a scientific role in this sense, but it was rather a role of mass producing and of supplying. And the company faced a lot of process, as also the picture shows, where and also a lot of manifestation outside its plants. And as a response, it always has this neutral position, as we are just fulfilling what are our contracts. We do not do policy. And in this sense, there was this kind of attempt of bureaucratizing responsibility and also to not make it personal. But this is exactly the place. The issue. We usually kind of approach ethics in research as a matter of the individual research, a matter of the individual scientist, without instead taking into consideration the bigger networks of relationships in which actually science unfolds as a form of labor. So in this sense, we can read those as did not act actually as a moral subject, so it doesn't enter our ethical kind of understanding, but rather it acted as a system. So in this sense, it was divided in hierarchies, for instance. It was shaped in institution, type of fundings. Also, it was organized in different labs that were not communicated with each other, so there was this compartmentalization of research. And also, it was driven by engineer optimization, for instance, of making the best product, but without actually looking at its consequences. So in this sense, in a certain extent, the way that Dow as an organization was organized and the form of labor that was performed was treated as the consequences. So using napalm unconditionally on Vietnam civilians as external part of the work performed at Dow. In this sense, we see a fragmentation of responsibility and also a difficult way to actually position ethics in this kind of more broad understanding of research as a form of labor. So in this sense, I think it's important, and to tie to today's question, to rethink responsibility in research. And in this sense, if we compare the two examples, so the compare of Pfizer and of Dow Chemical, we see some kind of interesting differences. So for instance, in the role, in also the proximity of their actions. So Pfizer was very close to the discovery, but instead like Dow Chemical were very distant for the application, for example. But also kind of the ambivalence in their response. While Pfizer, later in life, he regretted about his invention, instead Dow Chemical just delegated their responsibility to the government. And here I think is where like Butler comes with a point. So in this sense, ethics emerge as part of our structure in which we kind of understand society. And who is allowed to speak and who is allowed to respond also goes into this kind of way that we frame our views on society. In this sense, Pfizer stood within this framework. We live in a very individualistic kind of society in which the individual is addressed directly, and it is asked to respond. And this, of course, is something like that is positive, but it also lacks to take out part of the story. In this sense, in the case of Dow, he used this more of neutralizing ethics because it was spreading its role of how labor was organized. And in this sense, Vietnam civilians, for instance, was not included in this form. So where like the activity DOM was going, for instance, was not taken into consideration. So in this sense, what I think is important to make science ethical is, of course, to incorporate individual duties of the single research, but also how to understand how science and research are organized as a form of labor. So in this sense, the question is not just what did the scientists do, but also I think it's important who sets the agenda, for example, or who founded the work, or as well, who was allowed to speak and who was silenced. So to wrap up, I have some main takeaways. Perfect. So the first one is that it's not about, ethics is not just about bad actors, but I think there's something more about it. It's about who sets the term of work, about who gets to speak and who is left out, and also it's about redesign the system, the direct reason, and other organizations of labor. So in this sense, it's also important to understand how ethics is not only a question of individual responsibility, but it's a way of understanding relationships within daily work. And with this, thanks a lot for your attention. Oh, stay there, okay.
So I invite our speakers all up now. We'll transition, obviously, questions for Dario would be quite nice, but we'll also just transition broadly to a plenary questions for the speakers. Also feel free to respond to each other and the floor back to the people and back and forth. So any hands? Ah. Yeah.
So I think my question is related to the first two lectures, I guess. So as far as I heard, if we basically develop those weapons, we're basically increasing our chances to, you know, kind of defeat the bad actors. In that sense, it will be for peaceful means to win some war. But in a game theoretic way, I mean, you can think of it like the others as well will have the same means to do the same game, play the same game. And then we're transitioning in this zero-sum game where you have both parties are competing towards a goal of destruction. So my question is, how would that transition towards peace? Because you can think of autonomous weapons in the same way as killing efficiently. In a way, you can go as the atomic bomb. And then something like, if you have a button, then I have a bigger button. And how would that lead to peace?
To our speakers, any who'd like to respond?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think. So you mentioned the battle, but I think an important part is also the deterrence aspects. So that is always of the defense organization. They have a large role in deterrence, and deterrence only works when you have a strong army. So that is actually a peaceful situation. When it comes to this game theory you talked about, I agree. I mean, that is not a nice thing. Those are the arms races, and I frankly do not know a way out of it, because if you would one-sided aim to, I mean, that's the whole, what game theory also teaches us. If you would one-sided try to opt out, that would not be a good outcome either. But maybe you want to respond and have an answer to this.
Yeah, like another thing about the game theory part, it's this ugly cold calculation between adversaries. But one part of this ugly calculation, this cold calculation, is also to have an escalation and de-escalation ladder, which means that you have multiple means of different severity, different severities of harm to occur on one another, so that you can maybe rise some levels of severity on the level of escalation, and then find opportunity to de-escalate before you reach the biggest red button, let's say. So.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Maybe you can.
In history, it didn't work this way. Like, it happened that at some point someone dropped the bomb, right? So it didn't de-escalate at some point, even though at some point during the wars that one could argue that it was not necessarily to do this huge kind of destruction at some point.
Okay, works? Okay, super. So yeah, I mean, this is a little bit the paradox, you know, of rearming. Like, you will invest a lot in defense in order that to feel safe. Then, like, your neighbor will do the same, and then, like, you don't feel safe anymore. So you invest a lot, and then this race, no. But then in this case, I think even historically, it's interesting a little bit to see how this was approached. For in the 19th century, there was like this race of arms in Europe just before the First World War, no? And then, like, an important role had the public opinion, for example, because it's not that the arm race happens in isolation, right? It happens within society, within culture. So then also, like, you know, it's also this rising of tension. You can also feel it in the public opinion. And in this sense, like, there was a number of publications, for instance, novels or for that, you know, consumers, in which they were also talking about, you know, the war is happening because there was this, you know, rearmament in this way, in this race. And then actually what happened is that then, like, a random something, you know, isolated event happened in Serbia, and then, like, you know, First World War exploded. It just happened. But in this sense, I think it's also important to understand how even the public perception and how, like, it's communicated to the public, what role does it have? Because in this, I think that public has an important role in also kind of determining, in a sort of sense, like, the discourse of the agenda. No? There can be ways to kind of also de-escalate if the pressure comes from outside. In this sense, I think, you know, looking at arm race is also important to kind of understand the role that the public has in the role, and what type of pressure can it put.
Here, sorry, I'll scooch in.
I'll try and come back. Hello. So I had a question to the first speaker, and it's relating to a statement that was said, which is democratic countries will use weapons well if they are truly democratic. I take issue with the statement because throughout the 20th century, the so-called democratic states have always waged wars on their colonies, have developed weapons, and all of the weapons that were developed by the democratic institutions and the democratic governments were always used on civilians to suppress their right to self-determination, to suppress their right to decolonization, and back from, like, Vietnam or Libya or Afghanistan or Iraq, and currently now in Gaza, all of the weapons that are manufactured by the democratic states are being used, battle-tested on Palestinians, now that the ICJ is saying that it's a plausible genocide. And so all of these weapons companies are complicit in that. And so how do you tell me to be okay with the development of more weapons to save us from the enemy, but these weapons are always used on my neighbors and us?
Yeah, so I think you were referring to the slide that explains the social contract, and I did. That was not written down as a statement that democratic countries use their weapons well, because. Okay, but what I meant is that the assumption, in order for that theory to work, is that the democratic states uses that weapons well. Whether that is the case, that is of course, as the examples that you mentioned, not always the case, and I agree with that. But the model tries to establish a balance where there is a monopoly of violence for the state. And it does so under the assumption that the state has the obligation to use their weapons well, and the society can the state can hold it accountable and point to wrongdoings, right? And whether that system has worked, as you point out, it has not always worked, but it is a system, and it is the system that I think is the best one we've come up with so far.
But I would argue that it has always never worked, almost always, 99% has never worked. These weapons were, like, these weapons were always used in illegal wars. And let's say the war of Iraq, or even currently in Gaza. These, like, people who work in the arms industry, they make these weapons, make it available to states to commit genocide. How do we still argue that, it's fine in the greater scheme of things, it's gonna be fine? It's a bit difficult to convince people who are experiencing currently genocide in 3 different states currently, that still the production and like manufacturing and the research in these weapons to so-called security are still made. And they're actually quite horrifying, like the Hellfire weapon, which is a missile that has blades to decapitate civilians. How do you, in a way, how do you live with that, saying that it's fine?
It's also open to other speakers, and yeah, audience can respond, but maybe about the track record, it seems.
So what I talked about is also doing research in the defense domain. And what I also try to convey is, for me, that means doing research towards a defense organization that behaves ethically. And that also implies, and I particularly focus also my work on that, to have, to restrain from violence as much as possible. So the weapons you mentioned, fortunately, I have never worked on these things. And I personally wouldn't know how to deal with these questions when I had to make these kinds of systems more effective or more lethal, right? But I am engaged in a project which is called the Responsible AI in the military, where we try to understand what are the ethical implications of AI in defense. And by being part of that project, I think I can steer the military a little bit for the better. So that would be my answer. How do you live with it? Fortunately, I do not have to live with the situations that you mentioned. But I do think that research can do good, and not doing research would lead to ignorance and would make the situation worse.
Unless the other speakers want to comment, I had a question in the front row.
Okay. Assuming that good democracies use their weapons well, is there a set of questions we can ask ourselves to determine if it's still moral to work for the military, even if the political framework changes?
International humanitarian law. We have a system of international laws available, and we should keep that system intact. But please,
like really personal, like going through a set of questions, answer everything, then get a question or an answer.
Yeah. To answer that, I think that unfortunately ethics doesn't work like that. Ethics, unfortunately, is not a checklist. Like sometimes companies like that, they want like an ethical checklist, and if they do have those things, then they're ethical, and then they get a stamp, and they're good. But ethics is in like the interesting ethical questions, the ones that matter, are not answerable just like that. It's going to be a struggle usually, and it's always going to be some sort of gray zone and a trade-off or something like that. So I would say if you want to see if you act ethically, it's going to be a very personal and difficult personal questioning.
About the sort of institutional considerations that someone should make if they're looking at an institution, right? Maybe there's probably aerospace students here getting job offers. What would someone want to know about an institution, whether it's conducive or not? To
well, yeah, I mean, I don't work directly with the military, so have difficulty maybe like to bring inside a personal perspective. I think something I think is important is also to kind of understand the context in which one works. So, for instance, I think being informed of the history of your organization, for example, or like what type of relationships with who you collaborate, and also the values that they stand for. That I think is already our first step. And then of course, like in general, like military of course is about defense, but it can also be like kind of other activity. The military is also concerned of, for instance, intervene in situations of natural disaster, for example. No? So then military also has other jobs, not only in defending the border, but also in acting inside the border of the state. So that is also maybe another kind of perspective or another type of activity that the military takes out.
We have a few hands I've seen before, but one I haven't, so I'll go there first.
Thank you. You mentioned the concept of ethics. Is there a consensus on what makes a weapon ethical and another one not? For example, why do we have missiles with blades, but a bioweapon is not okay?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. Do you want to go first, or me?
I don't know. You can go.
Yeah. So I think the Geneva Conventions have been good steps in that direction to make to decide with each other that there are some weapons that are unacceptable, and for example, chemical weapons is on that list, but also landmines. And the criterion is whether they can distinguish between civilians and soldiers. And of course, you can argue about all these kind of rules that they made up. But it is something, and they have been also quite effective because chemical weapons have not been largely used after the First World War. So that is a little bit of consensus, and with respect to the AI debate, people are working on it to also have some regulations on AI in that same Geneva Conventions. I have been sideways involved in those discussions, but it's very difficult, but we try. Do you have some?
No, I wanted to mention the same, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is like just war theory, for example, that is like, I would say, maybe the major framework in which you try to like ethically reflect on war, but still like it's a difficult discussion, right? I mean, like, how can something be ethical when like the killing of people is involved? I mean, like, it's very tough. But I think it's also important maybe to kind of build on legacy from the past. So, for instance, the Geneva Convention, I think, is a wonderful example. I mean, it comes out then from the Second World War. So this like building for the past and try to like learn from the past, that I think is something like very important. But yeah, apparently maybe humanity is not so good in remembering from the past and in learning. But yeah, if you want to find like the main reference, let's say, then just war theory is like the place where to look at first. But yeah, it's complex.
We'll do 1, 2.
Yeah, like my neighbor said, in the past, it had to go wrong before there was regulation on chemical war and napalm and examples like that. Do you think there is a way to simulate the consequences of, for instance, killer robots or autonomous weapons, so we can make some regulation before we try it out and conclude that it's not the way to go, and a proper use of weapons to defend our democracy without selling out our democratic principles while doing so?
Well, we try, of course. I mean, we with these ethical research, we try to have scenarios and explain very well what could be the consequences. The question is whether a scientific paper is the best way of persuasion. Often, as you point out, it had to go wrong and then people learn. There have been some videos made that are really aimed at making people really scared about autonomous weapons, right? And yeah, that is another approach, but that's a different type of institute that makes these kind of things. So those are the more activist organizations.
We have other answers from the speakers. Anticipation, what do you look for when something's on the horizon? Is it possible to anticipate it, or are we always too late?
It's difficult for me to talk actually about military research, because I think it is a special case of technological development. But I would say that in general, like, always technology comes with uncertainty, right? And this is also, like, generally speaking, is kind of the challenge, right? We don't see it only in the military application, we also see in civil application, right? The regulation always is behind innovation. This is kind of a dilemma. It brings questions about uncertainties. And there are, of course, ways to deal with it. So, of course, I already try to incorporate maybe core values and try to think about possible users, for example, the needs of users. But this applies less maybe to military technology. So yeah, so in this sense, I have less experience.
Don't you need military research to be able to have the right regulation?
Yeah, I guess to a certain extent, but also maybe, like, is that, like, what you will define as military, like, research, right? Because you can, like, still make for instance, like, scenario thinking on sort of technology without necessarily military research. So then also, like, what counts as military research? How do you define military research? How you define, like, military activity in general? Is there a difference between, like, defense and attack, for example? Design technology for defense, design technology for attack. So this is also, I think, a way to, like, kind of, deconstruct maybe the question.
We had the question here.
I had 2 questions, but I'll keep both short. So the first question was the difference between biological and chemical warfare versus using AI. I think with biological and chemical, there's a level of traceability that you can sort of see the traceability as to how it goes back to how it was used. But with AI, I fail to see how there would be a level of traceability, because these algorithms are, again, protected for national security reasons. So how do we hold someone accountable? And my second question is about autonomous weapons. So I fail to understand how autonomous weapons are essentially autonomous, because there's an algorithm that's written underneath it. So they're not intrinsically making decisions themselves. So then I feel like it, again, ties back to Dario's concept of fragmenting responsibility. I feel like you use this term autonomous to distance yourself from your own invention per se, so that you don't feel responsible yourself. You say that the responsibility is on the invention. It's on the AI autonomous drone, for example. Let's say this drone ends up killing your own civilians, your own soldiers, then who's responsible? Is it the modeler? Is it the technology? So, yeah.
Yeah, these are excellent points. So the first one, you are absolutely right. That's the big difference. I mean, you cannot prove that somebody used fully autonomous weapons, because that's the type of weapons that we feel is objectionable. But people will always say, well, there was some human in the loop who was directing that thing, and when the battle has ended, you cannot see traces of chemicals or, in this case, an autonomous algorithm. So that is, you answered that question. That's a great observation. The second one is people in these negotiations, people use the term meaningful human control, which means that the human is in control of all the ethical decisions that are being made. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you have a teleoperated robot, they have that property. So if you steer a robot from, and you have direct video linkage, then you know what the robot is doing. The problem with that is that these robots are being jammed and there's no radio connection anymore. So there is a push towards more autonomy, which means that this robot can fly without direct human intervention. So these systems are being made. And now the question is, what counts as sufficient control? Would it count that if the human 1 minute before understands the situation and gives a precise instructions to the robot, and then the robot does its thing, is that still under control or not? Or if the human gives a very vague description, I want you to keep this area safe, and then the robots use all kinds of tactics which the human did not anticipate, I think that's no longer control. But drawing that boundary is the topic of the kind of research that philosophers and legal policymakers and AI specialists are doing to try to understand this field and eventually come to regulation.
Okay, yeah, I think I was to say that actually, like, words really matter. So I like a lot of your point about autonomous and how this also can direct the discourse in a certain way. But then also often like it's not always the case. No? So even like technology even changed the way of making war, of course, but also changed the relationship with war. So in this sense, I was also thinking during like posing your question how, for instance, even drones and drones warfare change a lot like the proximity of war. No? So for instance, what is interesting, this I think relates to the really nice presentation of Luca, no? Of how war also becomes like, so like total in the sense that there's not anymore like war something outside as the battlefield, like you know, warriors go there, the two army go there, they combat in the battlefield, and then they go back home, and then like you know you had this kind of place outside of society, but now we say instead like, and this probably like from the Second World War, First World War, so from the last century that actually war is within society, right? The battlefield is within society. So in this sense, even how so the technology, I'm thinking about drones, kind of change our relationship with war is something I think is interesting, and in this sense, I think words really matter. So for instance, like they're like kind of, they had the headline some years ago, this case of pilots of drones that, you know, they were like, from home, they were like driving their drones, so 8-hour shifts, then was back home, and then they had post-traumatic disorder, just because the battlefield was always kind of present. No, it was not something separate. So in this sense, I think when thinking about you know, military technologies, technology more in general, but for today, military technology, then I also think it's important to kind of think how it changed the relationships and the meaning of certain words on how they were like maybe historically used. So in this sense, I think even technology in a sort of sense challenge our own understanding of what is actually war, where does war takes place, how the practice of war happens, and what is the experience of war. So that I think is also to add.
Yeah, and maybe just a last thing to add, because these were really great answers, is that there's also an arms race again in automation. It's like that some threats, for example, can be so fast that you cannot, as a human, react fast enough to defend against it. So you have to, in turn, defend or like automate your defense again to keep up with it. And that's again an arms race, and that drives this automation as well.
We have a few speakers. My one philosophy pitch is the case of autonomous weapons has been compared in some cases to using child soldiers. So in the same way, it's reprehensible to set a child to war because they could commit an atrocity without being legally held responsible. Similarly, it was framed in one famous paper by a guy named Sparrow that autonomous weapons are like sending kids to war. Obviously, kids is bad for a number of other reasons, but this is one framing is in this way. But we have a few other questions.
I have a question actually more for Dario. As far as I understand your talk, you basically explained that to do ethical technological development, we need to basically have as many perspectives as possible and to have as many contributions to what we want to develop. But when it comes to military research, which is intrinsically very secretive, how is that even possible? So in other words, isn't military research intrinsically unethical?
Yeah, well, to understand, maybe I will agree, but the point was that, well, even like military a lot of time like they draw even for civilian society, but a lot of time like this kind of relationships are not so clear, or not so like evident, not so transparent. So this was a little bit the example of that I wanted to illustrate about the chemical, right? The people working down were most civilians. Also, as a company, it was a civilian company. They just had a contract. And they could have other type of contract with the government, and this contract was about producing napalm for then like supply the military defense. But often like this kind of relationships within like the daily work was kind of uncovered due to this compartmentalization, this distribution of work. And I think in this sense, how usually like responsibility in research is kind of framed. There are a lot of emphasis on the individual practitioner. Of course, this is something very important, right? It is important to have reflective researchers that kind of they think about their own practice, and they think about their own kind of what they are developing. But also, I think it's important to also kind of contextualize this kind of activity as how research as type of work is then organized, is then like outsourced, and how it is distributed. Because in this sense, of course, to make this very complex technology, you need a number of different personnel, a number of different researchers that have to collaborate and and coordinate. And often this kind of, in this process, often bigger picture is kind of lost, right? And having this lost often implies that even the boundaries between the military and the civilian is not anymore so clear, as in the case of Dow that I wanted to show. So in this sense, I think it's important to kind of also address ethics also as research, not only as the ethics of science, but actually as science as a form of work. And therefore, then we can have another type of discussion.
Do we have other responses from the other speakers?
Yeah, maybe what I can say is that I think ethical considerations are always considerations between different values that you have to weigh against one another. And I think in the case of science in defense, one of the considerations is that making sure that what you're developing is behind closed doors in which mechanisms that you choose is a consideration that is that supersedes the principle or the desire of having multiple perspectives, because that would be the ideal case, which that would be really nice. I would love that in my work as well, but it's just not practically feasible, simply saying.
Yeah. So maybe to add to that, most of the work I do is open. So I guess it differs a little bit on the domain. Probably the technology that you are working on is often on the secret domain. I think particularly when it comes to the human-machine interaction and the ethical aspects, it's important to have it open and also to involve society in it, in these discussions, like we are doing now actually.
The one fun fact I'll share, because it's my research direction a little bit, is in the United States, the Library of Congress, which is supposed to be a universal repository of all published work, grows every year by about 60 million pages. Classified documents, which are for either military or national security reasons classified, grows by 250 million pages a year. The last time we got that info was 2008. We don't know. So it's one of these things where indeed the world of that which is done in varying degrees of classification. I had to apply for classification from my research, clearance, pardon, didn't get it. It's a feature of the labor process and access, so I think it's just very interesting. But we have a question here. So I'm supposed to hold it.
Sorry, yes, it's quite a short question actually. I got triggered by your, Jurriaan, by your first slide from you have the people that are really 100% pacifists, and you have the realists, and that people in the middle that you can use violent. Oh, sorry, yeah. Oh, it was your slide.
Oh, yeah,
sorry.
sure.
Yeah, but then I think both. Luca, I think you had an experience that you said, okay, I was on that side, non-violent, but then, okay, the Kiev event happened, and that made me switch ideas and become more in support of developing, researching, also defense kind of research. Could you imagine that there would be a point that you make a switch the other way around, that you say, okay, this is the limit, I won't do any research anymore in defense?
Yeah. So my view is that that ethics is local and contingent. So I do not really, I find it very difficult to completely subscribe to the idea that there's like a universal global ethics. So my standpoint is my standpoint now in time and now at this place, and it makes sense to me now. So I can easily imagine that, or maybe not easily, but I can imagine the point that things shift again where we'll have to adapt my ethical framework as well. And I definitely think that it's possible.
We had a question here.
Dario, you mentioned that there is a role of education in ethics, or of ethics in education, and from what I remember from my AI masters, it was not compulsory. So we are potentially sending out people who are not critically thinking about the ethics of a subject into development of that subject. And a lot of the narrative was indeed about individual ethics versus compared to something like Butler's ethics, which is more about the system, or care ethics, which is more about the relationship. So yeah, my question is, what do you think the role of education is in ethics? Can it make a difference? And if yes, then what kind of narrative should we have?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually love the question. I think it's a great one, and it's something that also like as a section we kind of we are continuing talking about it. I think a question goes like, what is the role of education today, or what does like education like institutions, universities do? What is their role in society? In this sense, I think already, at least if I'm thinking like about the Netherlands, I think already like it is an interesting kind of approach. So I know that for the other countries, the ethics equals like legal. So for instance, even in the teacher and engineer, a lot of times it's about more understanding the laws in place, rather instead like where those laws are coming from, or how to understand like the role the one has. But on the other part, I also think that maybe there's not sufficient like kind of time in the curriculum dedicated to ethics, or even like the way that we are presenting often goes like what is like the major, let's say, Western tradition. No? So then you talk like consequentialism, so Mills, then you talk, Kant, of course, Aristotle. But then I think there are like other ways that ethics could be taught us, especially like in the last decades, a lot of interesting perspective coming from the feminist tradition, for example, or even like things as, thinking beyond like just human ethics or anthropocentric approach. I think like in other kind of terms, what is like the role, how can we navigate complex decisions, or even take into consideration even like other type of perspectives. In this sense, I think somehow like it should really be embedded us, also because of all the challenges that we see in today in society, going from, of course, like rise of geopolitical tension, go to climate change and everything. So in this sense, I think maybe it's important to also take other kind of more relational kind of approaches, but then how exactly do it where there are real material constraints in time, budget, and so forth. So it's not it's difficult then to implement.
Other comments from the speakers, or?
Yeah, I can. What I also find interesting about the question is how to design the curriculum to engage students that, like, for a philosophical course who are not studying philosophy, because. Like you said that the philosophical course was not mandatory, and I studied philosophy, and I say make it mandatory for everybody. I love this. This is great. I was also grading undergrad students doing my philosophy masters from students who studied something other than philosophy, but took I think back then it was mandatory little philosophy class. And the teachers with whom I did the grading, they often said they would find it very difficult to get the class engaged. And I find that just a very interesting problem, why that is, what is going on. Because the same teachers would teach me a class and I would be on fire and love everything that I hear, but why did it transfer to other domains? And that's, I don't have an answer to that, but that's just something, yeah, it's interesting.
I teach ethics, so I'll throw myself into the ring, but also briefly under the bus. There's a lot of empirical research about what ethics education does to behavior. Doesn't look as promising as we would like it to. So if you want to look it up, it's a whole field of, is our way of teaching, does it work? And what needs to happen for it to work? So not to throw my entire justification to be funded here under the bus, but we have a question here.
Yeah, I was wondering, the state in the social contract, the state can apply violence. I was wondering, the politics is deciding whether we apply violence or not. So we didn't talk about politics, but also the industries and the research. But finally, the state is applying the ethics, whether we apply violence or not. And what do you think about it?
It's a great question. So you can make a distinction between the government and the state, and you can disagree with the government, but still trust the state. And maybe that issue has become more pressing recently in Dutch politics and also politics elsewhere. But maybe, Nick, you're also a philosopher.
Perhaps a problem is, even within democratic states, that democratic states tend to declare a state of emergency or a state of exception. And then we have the problem that sometimes more explicit, sometimes more implicit. Look at the laws on terrorism, for instance. And then the problem is there's a kind of legalization of an exception, which is very, very dangerous, of course, especially in democratic states. So that's what I would like to add.
But it's still, we can tweak these checks and balances, right? So I tend to think that when talking about police force and the military, they are our police force and military, and the society, the civilians have granted power to them. And we can reorganize that. It won't always be an easy problem, but we can try.
Also, maybe like if I can try to complement, I also think it's like interesting because like generalizing also like points to two different views of what is like human nature, right? So in one sense, there's this view like that sees actually like the before the social contrast, like whatever. Actually, this is like this violent war, right? And then we need a state. We give part of our freedom in order to create a state and to be defended. But also there is also the other view, right? There is also the other stream that instead has this romanticization of what there was before, no? And see instead like instead like is through like how kind of society to its structure like also can repress actually the people inside. So this also I think is interesting to see how like the question of violence is a question very difficult, no? And you can approach it for other parts, but like generalizing and connected to the political question, I also think it's interesting to kind of understand like how two different perspectives come of place. On one side, like this idea that well, humans are just simply like inherently kind of bad, that we are just like violent, and therefore like we need politics, a strong state in order to protect us all. But then on the other part, instead, this other kind of understanding of human nature, as humans as being like as entities good, inherently good, no? And therefore, like actually the state could be actually on the other part. Actually, the state can cause violence because it can cause like kind of tension. So this is also kind of interesting how like in general, like philosophically speaking, like different tradition has thought about this question about the state in relation to violence with two different kind of starting points.
I can offer, so I'm an American citizen who has strong feelings about these topics, and it's my research direction in my own country. But I was reading recently some old history book about like the Spartans or whatever, and when the king went out to war and he came back, they had a moment where they're like, how did you behave? And sometimes if they behaved badly, according to their standards, they would be punished. When I think about my own country, yeah, who was held accountable for Vietnam? Who was held accountable for supporting Iraq's invasion of Iran? So far, my country has not demonstrated a capacity for accountability. And I think trust should ideally be hinged on the notion that it's capable of holding itself accountable, or that society can. And we had strong protests against the Iraq war, but unfortunately not perhaps as successful as they could have been. But it seems that trust is, in actuality, based on the ability to, say, provide services and maintain a certain quality of life and deliver on other metrics. So I think the political project, for me as an American looking at right now my government talking about annexing neighbor states, it's too late to flex the muscle of accountability, I worry, because it has not been flexed in the past adequately. So for me, when I think about my national context, it's deeply concerning on that front. And the political question is, at least for a country like the United States, paramount, and without which I think it's hard to talk about these questions. We have a few minutes. I'll look for 1, 2 folks who have not spoken yet.
Hey, yeah, I had a question for Luca. So earlier on you were talking about that it's kind of weird that we have this sort of different attitudes towards civilian life and the military. I think Derek gave an interesting piece of that puzzle, is that, for example, before World War I, we had intensive national pride and a sort of militarization of society. And right now, NATO is beating the war drums, right? We want to have more money for weapons. So I feel like if we start to accept the military sort of sphere of influence as a normal thing, a thing that we need to interact with, it's reasonable, they make weapons, we make weapons, we very much inevitably are going to end up in a situation with war because the pressure towards an arms race depends on society supporting it. So the more we normalize military life and the industry to like make it a normal thing in society, the more we go towards that direction. So I think it's important that we try to avoid this normalization and instead start to see it as a best case scenario, a necessary evil in some situations, but try to reduce the funding for it whenever possible.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting remark, thank you. I think that going the way of like sort of repressing the military domain is counterproductive in avoiding wars, because I think that actually mixing in the military and in the civilian domain generates more awareness of the topic among the citizenship, and also creates like civilian pressure on politics in whether to engage in a conflict or not, or something like that. And so I would say that that mixing military and the civilian domain leads actually to what you hope to achieve. So I don't know if I agree with you on your point, but it's an interesting thought.
From the other speakers, anything further? Otherwise, last question.
I mean, I think, I know. I just think it goes when also do the role that the public kind of plays, no? Like, I think it's like how also we started a kind of this panel, no? To this armor race, and how like public plays a role. I also think in this case, public really plays a role, because of course, like, if you start to say, oh, the war is coming, then the war will come, right? And in this sense, I think even also as a society, but even as a culture, we try to think about, well, maybe even sometimes we kind of romanticize maybe about war, no? In different forms of cultural products, no? From like, you know, series, video games, right? Movies, you name it. So then I think it's like also as a collective, if also war plays this kind of role in our like imagination. As a public, I think there is a kind of some way of addressing directly kind of the discourse. Of course, it's complex, it's difficult to disentangle, right? But I think like the role that the public has, I think this is something important, and maybe so far as it is in the current situation, I don't know how much it is stressed actually.
Just one thing I want to add to that as well. I think also what is important to consider is the experience of veterans after returning from war, because often they have experienced atrocities that they cannot find a place for anymore in, let's say, peaceful society. Because I think as a veteran, having gone to war, you have witnessed things that distorted your view of reality, that when you bring it home doesn't fit anymore to the way of behaving in society, or it's difficult to function anymore. And I think or like integrating those properly with society helps understanding what war means and the brutality that comes along with it, rather than, because I think a side effect of trying to separate military life and civil war is chastising and castigating veterans and their experiences as not fitting to the normalization that we have in society.
Then it was the question here, right? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for you guys being open and honest. I know it's a little bit of a stigmatized topic, so I'm going to go back to the first question that was posed, which was, should I work for the military? And I'm asking it in the context of, you guys are doing research, okay? You're not the one pushing the button or taking the shot or whatever. Does that distance make a difference in your moral stance to work for the military? If you had to push the button, would it change things?
It's a very good question. Personally, I think not, because I think it would be a little bit weird hiding behind, I just do the research and then other people make decisions. I think you are responsible for also the results of what you are doing. It would make a difference for which military organization I would work, obviously.
Yeah, I would agree with that answer. I think drawing a line somewhere between from research to the application and saying and having a distance then to the end outcome is too comfortable a position to take in. It's hard to say what would happen in the situation itself, of course. I don't know myself in that situation, so I cannot answer it. But I hope I would be consistent if the situation would arise. I will leave it at that.
So I look to our friends from Studium Generale. Time to transition to food and drinks, as I understand. So thank you to everyone for asking questions, your engagement, and thank you to, of course, our speakers. Feel free to keep chatting, but the formal section is over.